At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jar.
And I am Anthony Sie, and welcome to Focus on Liberia. This is our program that Liberia History Channel always presented here by Mr. Call family. I'm Anthony Sie, sitting in today for my partner, Dennis Jar. It's the history class, I would like to call it, and it's an opportunity for all of us to reflect so deeply on our history from what we always have here as a brilliant presentation from our presenter called Family, looking deeper and deeper into Liberia's history to understand who we are and the country Liberia. It will help. And so if you are just joining us, we want to say welcome and share the broadcast with as many Liberians as possible. We must know our history. We must know ourselves. In today's edition of the Liberian History Channel, we continue on the series, Presidents of Liberia. And today is President Hilary R.W. Johnson. At this time, I will welcome our presenter, Mr. Cole Famada. It's good to have you. How you doing?
Great. It's always my pleasure to be here and share what I've learned with your audience. And we're on it again. President Johnson. And just so that everyone knows, I try to do a little bit of genealogy. I try to dig into things that are not as common and as obvious. So a lot of what I present is off the beaten path. It's what I would want people to know about me if I one day when I pass. So I try to make sure that I humanize the presidents and give them their due respect as human beings and not just names and dates.
Thank you so very much. I know we'll get to our slides. Before we do that, what should we expect to know as briefly as you can be about President Hilary R.W. Johnson that you are bringing to us today?
So what we're really going to know about President Johnson is what I try to do with everyone, as much genealogy as possible, meaning digging into their ancestry, who their parents were, their grandparents if possible. With President Johnson, there's a little bit of mystery around one of his parents, which is his mother. I'll get into that a bit. We'll talk, of course, about his great father, who was, in my mind, I consider him to be the founder of the Republic of Liberia. Okay. And so there's just a lot. He, unfortunately, most of his life lived in the shadow of his father's memory because his father was so great, as many of us do, who were born to incredible parents. You often are compared to them or referenced. Your identity is always in reference to your parents. And in the case of President Johnson, he was always compared to his father, which was very unfair. So he wasn't exactly his father's son, but he was in his own right a great man. When I say not his father's son, I mean he wasn't as domineering as his father was. He was more of a subtle and a softer human being than his father. And we'll get into that with the slideshow.
Thank you. Thank you. So now we have our first slide here.
Yes.
And so this is, go ahead.
So this again is a photograph of President Johnson. Mm-hmm. He appears as Hilary Richard Wright Johnson. He was the 11th president. The most important thing, I would say, or significant thing, he's the first president to be born in Liberia.
Okay.
The first 10 presidents were born in the United States. Hilary Richard Wright Johnson was born in Monrovia, when it was the city of Monrovia in the Commonwealth of Liberia. So he's the first president to be born on the continent of Africa. And another thing that's very important about him, not only was he born on the continent of Africa, born on the Commonwealth of Liberia, but I would say he's the first president whose mother was born. Anyway, I'll leave that to the slideshow.
Okay.
So, yeah.
So,
one of the things I want to note here is, before we go to the next slide, I want, I don't know if you can blow this up, but I want people to take note of his hair texture.
okay.
And I focus a lot on ethnicity only because, not that it's as important, but only because a lot of the ethnicity of our presidents were distorted for whatever reason. And many descriptions of President Johnson on websites and other places refer to him as a mulatto. A mulatto at this time period meant you had one white parent and one black parent, and most often than not, it was your father who was white and your mother who was African because of slavery and all those things. But Hilary Richard Wright Johnson was not a mulatto. And, this is something that I hate to have to constantly correct, but it is important because people should be portrayed in their actual likeness. We should not be in a position in modern times to revise history to suit whatever mindset we have in the modern era. These people were human beings and they have the right to have existed as they were, and we need to respect them for who they were. And so I don't take it lightly when I point these things out, because I would not want someone to change my heritage when in the future either, generations later. I think it is an affront to their memory. And also that kind of distortion that they do of people's identities after they die is almost a way of lynching them, of burying them, destroying their likeness. So this is who he actually was. You look at his hair texture, it is not, it's not any different from my hair texture or your hair texture, right?
Right.
And his mother was African. So his father was described as a Negro. Was his father light-skinned? Probably. Was his father mulatto? I didn't see any evidence that his father was half white, half black. Did he have some European heritage? Probably. But what I do know is that he was repeatedly described as a Negro in texts where actual mulattoes were also described as mulattoes. So maybe he had been a light-skinned Negro, possibly. His mother was African. Hilary Richard Wright Johnson was not a mulatto.
And Carl, quickly, what is that clarification necessary concerning whether some people might have thought he was a mulatto? Why is that important to make that clarity?
Because it's the truth. The truth is more important than whatever distortions people have. And people's identity, people's likeness needs to be preserved and respected.
Okay.
It just is what it is. I mean, so I kind of covered that. And in a lot of this distortion, whitewashing our presidents, we've gone over this repeatedly, but it is absolutely wrong. Hillary was photographed, thank goodness, because had he not been photographed, we would think otherwise about who he was. Attributing anybody's greatness to non-existent European fathers is the problem. And if you listen to the narrative of Liberian history, yeah, it's distorted, because these are things that are clearly not true, that have been repeatedly published in various places. I mean, if you Google them, you'll find websites dedicated to Liberia inaccurately describing people, and it's unfortunate.
Yeah, that is true, and it was good you emphasized on his hair texture there, and even the way it looks. We know us when we see us, especially when you are a boy coming up and stay in a younger age, you see that. Even when you get older, it's clear.
Right.
So thanks for that clarification. And
Absolutely.
so here we are.
So we go through this, and I'm going to probably go through this with every single president going forward. But
Mhm.
again, you see the sketch that was done in 1952, which again, that was really what shows up in Liberian textbooks,
Mhm.
is this drawing on the right, which is based on the um, photographed on the left.
Mhm.
And as you can, I mean, he's clearly not. I mean, they clearly saw the photograph, and if you can see, they made his hair texture much straighter than it is,
Mhm.
and it was in reality when he was living. Um, this is just an outrage to me, because if a young person sees this, how would they even know who he was? It's just So I just wanted to point it out, and that's it's sad.
Sad indeed. And before you continue on, I'm glad you said, how is a young person who probably is not using their analytical skills be able to tell whether the person on my right hand side who's looking white is not actually President Hilary R.W. Johnson, who is obvious is a Negro as we see in the picture. So is it that somebody had an agenda to have depicted him in this way and not resemble his actual identity as a human being?
So I don't know. What I do know about history is that they do this a lot in Africa. They
Mhm.
did this with the Moors, with African people. The Moors of Spain, they wanted to try, to erase their blackness and attribute them to the Arab people. Fortunately for the Moors of Spain, the artists of the time period, painted portraits of them, and they were very black men. And the same thing with ancient Egypt and all ancient civilizations. The first thing is, because of this pseudoscience, the pseudo ideology of white supremacy, they must whiten things to justify the subjugation of African people. So when African people exhibit any greatness, they should be whitewashed. And this is a ancient. They've been doing this, since the 19th century, and it continued to the 20th century. This is more shocking for me because it's just so recent, right? They're doing this in the 1950s, um, which is not, it's not even 100 years ago. This man had not even been dead for 60 years, and here they were whitening him. So, and he was photographed. They did it, over and over again. So I just wanted to start it off. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just wanted to point out who he actually was. Look at his hair texture. Look at his features. You can tell the sketch on the drawing is based on the photograph, but it was, they didn't, the Bruns, his name was Bruns, the gentleman who drew these pictures. He was an American, he was white. He didn't want to draw them as they actually were. He felt the need to make them look more European, and that's unfortunate.
So for those who might have some little bit of confusion here with the text below, the image on the left-hand side is the image that was done in 1883, and the one that looks white is the one done in 1952. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it's more than an image; it's a photograph. So that is
Photograph.
actually
Okay.
him,
Okay.
right? That's
Mhm.
actually him. That's a photograph, and the drawing
Mhm.
is what was done in 1952.
1952.
So one is a photograph and one is a drawing.
Yeah. That that
So this
that
is
that.
before they had all those apps, that would change people. Use those
Right.
apps they have when they rob you. You talk about the 1950s, So
Mhm.
it's a hand, manually done app to whiten somebody.
Right.
Yeah. So
Okay. So go ahead. What's going on here?
all right. So usually Dennis would read this, but basically what we're looking at.
Mhm.
Let me go ahead and pull up my copy so I can read it. Hold on.
Okay.
So this is a depiction, the art is a depiction of the War of 1812. During the War of 1812, Black soldiers served in both integrated regiments as well as in all Black regiments. Why am I bringing this up? I'm doing a genealogical background. So Elijah Johnson, the father of Hilary Richard Wright Johnson, fought in the War of 1812. During that time, several northern states, including New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, and others, recruited entire regiments of Black soldiers. And even some southern states like Louisiana and North Carolina established Black soldiers in regiments. 2 battalions of free men of color served several other units and participated in great American victory of the British during the Battle of New Orleans. So the War of 1812 was the U.S. versus England, territorial battles. Elijah Johnson, in most of the literature, is described as a Negro soldier who served with courage and distinction. So they're not calling him a mulatto, they're calling him a Negro. In the same text, they refer to other soldiers, colored soldiers, as mulattoes. That's important. But Elijah Johnson, what's really powerful about this is that he was able to understand the British issue, that the British were not necessarily your friends, and that the British were territory hungry, and that the British were always going to be fighting to, because he had this experience with the war, he understood the mindset of the British, that they were conniving, and they would renege on treaties and agreements, and he didn't trust the British. His war experience also taught him how to fight. I mean, he was a trained and experienced soldier when he went to Liberia at the age of 29. He was a veteran military person. So he was used to fighting battles under very terrible conditions. The conditions for Black soldiers in the War of 1812, even as late as the late as the Civil War, and even as late as the Vietnam War, World War I, World War II, Black American soldiers had it far worse than their white counterparts. So we're going way back to the War of 1812. This is before the Civil War. Imagine the conditions that he was subjected to and survived and triumphed. America won the war. He now is taking that experience. He's battle scarred, that experience to Liberia with him. Elijah Johnson also is accused of having many children in the United States before going to Liberia, with two of which were abandoned in an orphanage. So he has many, many descendants when he goes to Liberia. Next slide, please. Unless you have questions on this.
No, I don't have question. We'll go to no, I think I should ask question here quickly. Just came to my colleague. So this is the War of 1812. Elijah Johnson having to be the father of Hilary Johnson, correct?
Yes.
And so the historical piece you just explained here, this is him fighting with courage and distinction in a war and be identified as a Black person. So what is this piece of history important in understanding the identity of the President Hilary R.W. Johnson?
So this is his father, and as I usually do with the History Channel, I try to talk a little bit about their parents to give insight to how they were brought up and their mindsets. Okay. Because a lot of what makes up who we are is the people who we come from and the example that they set. So this is part of us describing his identity. So Hilary's identity is rooted in who his father was.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So this is just, so his father immigrated to he immigrated on the ship Elizabeth to Cherbourg. He was one of those who left and arrived in 1820. The ship Elizabeth was the first immigrant ship to Africa, organized by the U.S. government in conjunction, in a joint effort with the American Colonization Society. Hilary Johnson was on that vessel. He was one of those who survived the mass death of immigrants at Sherbrooke. And that's also remarkable because many of the people who went, including the agent Bacon and others, perished probably due to tuberculosis and malaria. Hilary survived and made it to Liberia later on board the Alligator, which transferred the first 2 shiploads of immigrants to Cape Mesurado in 1822.
And the Alligator here is another ship, is that correct?
Yeah, so what it basically, yes, another vessel took them 2 years later to Cape Mesurado when they finally were able to sign that treaty, to have a place to settle that was supposedly much safer than Sherbrooke. But as they arrived, they came to find out it was not safer at all, and they had more issues. So here you've survived, death from disease, and now they go to Cape Mesurado 2 years later on another vessel, because we have to remember the Elizabeth never made it to Liberia, never made it to Cape Mesurado. It dropped them off in what is now Sierra Leone and returned. And it never touched Liberia. So they were transferred over later, 2 years later, when finally there was an agreement for Perseverance Island, what we call Providence Island today.
Caught my curiosity, these ships, as they made their way to Africa out of the United States, how long was it taking them on a journey to Africa at the time?
About 3 months on average.
3 months.
3 months, yeah.
Wow, 3 months on the sea, that gotta be tough.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at here?
So this, I don't know if you can blow this up, but we do this every episode.
Right.
This is basically the ship manifest to show his family members who arrived. His mother was not on the Elizabeth. His mother was not on any ship that arrived before the year of his birth. So there's no record of, before 1837, there's no record of a Rachel Wright, as people have said his mother's name was. So his mother was not on the ship, but his father and his father's former wife, who died in 1820 of fever. So Elijah was 29. His wife arrived with him at Sherbrooke, and if you look to the right here, it says 1820. She died of fever, so she never even made it to Cape Mesurado, his first wife.
Right.
But he had, some children with Mary. There was Lewis Johnson, who was 10. Charles Johnson, who was 8, and then Elizabeth Johnson, who was 2 years old. So when there was the first battle with the day, what has been called the Battle of Crown Hill, when Elizabeth Johnson was about 4 years old, her father, Elijah Johnson, tied Elizabeth on his back while he fought against the Dey. So he had his daughter, Elizabeth, strapped on his back during the Battle of Crown Hill, or the first battle with the indigenous warriors. And that just, for me, that description is just, incredible. Imagine being a soldier and you don't want your child to be kidnapped or harmed during this battle. So you tie her on your back as you fight. And then they both were able to survive, which is, just incredible.
Yes, indeed. So here, let me read this.
Okay.
As early as 1822, there was not a white American on the Cape. The hostile climate put to flight even the tripartite Dr. Hilary. It have destroyed Liberia, root and branch. Had it not been for the heroic conduct of one of the noblest men the world has ever seen. He was a Negro. The name of Elijah Johnson is held in great reverence by all of his countrymen.
Like Toussaint's overture, he was brave and heroic. This is written by T. McCant Stewart. Toussaint, he's comparing Elijah to Toussaint Louverture, who was the revolutionary in Haiti who overthrew the Napoleonic army and fought in this. So T. McCant Stewart, who is an African American, he was an African American historian, author, describes Elijah Johnson as a Negro again, and also goes on to explain that, you know, he was this courageous man. So Elijah Johnson had tremendous shoes to fill. I'm sorry, Hilary Richard Wright Johnson had tremendous shoes to fill. There's very few people in Liberian history. In fact, he's the only person who was never president who was referred to and held in such high reverence. Some call him the father of Liberia. They say that Liberia exists because of Hilary Richard Wright Johnson's father, Elijah. And that Joseph Jenkins Roberts was just the first president. But the reason Liberia exists at all is Hilary Richard Wright Johnson. I'm sorry, it's because of Elijah Johnson.
Elijah Johnson, the father.
Yes, the father. So so we can go to the next slide. I just wanted to point out that these are some big shoes, you know, for anyone to have to fill. Now this next passage, you know, is important because this is where we start to see this is the most famous quote and the most important decision. This is the most important decision that was made. Of all the adversity we've had as Liberians, this was a critical, pivotal moment where Liberia would have become, you know, merged with Sierra Leone, and we would not have had the distinction of being the first republic. We would have remained colonized until the 1950s by the British had this particular situation not happened. The Day Warriors took advantage of Ashman's absence to menace the settlement with another attack. Hootie Ashman had left and literally abandoned them there with very little to protect themselves. Tired and sick, with very few men, about 10 able-bodied men, some of which were young boys, really teenagers, to protect the settlement. So we all know that they had been attacked, and we have a previous episode where we described that battle in great detail. That's the battle. The original battle was what they described in later history books as the Battle of Crown Hill, and they make up stories about Matilda Newport that never occurred. But the original battle was really not a triumphant battle for the settlement. They were brutalized. They had casualties and really barely defended themselves. So at this point, Elijah Johnson is trying to, get help from the British man of war, this British naval ship that's off the coast.
Right.
I also have to point out this British naval ship off the coast trading with the indigenous, giving them arms. This should raise a red flag. And Elijah is trying to get the same British to give him weapons.
Right.
So who are they giving them arms to fight against? Is it not, hey, let's terrorize this colony and maybe we will be in a position to come forward? I need to give a little bit of background here.
Please do.
When Captain Stockton and Eli Ayers arrived on the coast, the person who sold them Providence or Perseverance Island, as it was called, was John S. Mill, who was half English and half African.
Okay.
John S. Mill was the son of a British slave trader. And Providence or Perseverance Islands was once a slave depot, a factory, a holding ground for enslaved people to be sold across the Atlantic. Also, you had Boatswain, who was an agent of the British, who was sent by the British a few years earlier to hoist the British flag as far as Boparu. So you have heavy British presence at Cape Mesurado. Now you have this group of Americans who have procured land for the recaptured Africans and African Americans. There is suddenly conflict. After they had agreed, there's this conflict that arises. Something or someone has instigated conflict against this small band of unprotected colonists. The first battle, they shot and killed many of the colonists and ran away, or not ran away, but kidnapped, abducted children of the colony, including President, who would become President Stephen Allen Benson when he was 6 years old. We talked about this before. So I wanted to give that background. That first battle has ended, and now they're threatening them again, the survivors, and there's still no ammunition. They don't have protection. They don't have soldiers. They just have now an even more beaten and battered group. The surviving women, children, and men. So, so what is saying the day warriors took advantage of Ashman's absence to menace the settlement with another attack. And Mr. Johnson, this is Elijah Johnson, applied to the British man of war, then in harbor. So it was in harbor at Cape Mesurado. He applied for ammunition, and that was given to him freely. They gave him ammunition. They didn't have any ammunition. The weapons were, some of the weapons, were not, adequate. And the captain also offered his men to aid them in their defense. So the captain now is saying, hey, we can send some soldiers to help you all defend yourselves. If Mr. Johnson would allow them to, I'm sorry, I can't see it well. So basically, Mr. Johnson would allow to England a piece of land large enough to plant her flagstaff upon. So they're saying, hey, we'll help you, we'll give you some soldiers, but let us plant our flag. Let us plant our flag here so that then we can be allowed to allow our soldiers to fight, because our soldiers can only fight under our flag. As British troops could only be called upon to defend a flag and soil of their own country. So think about this. You've had people killed, you've had women killed, children abducted. You've had a lot of the young men have been shot by the day, shot and killed by the day. And now you have even the weaker surviving remnants of that. They're asking for ammunition. The British are like, hey, we've got all these soldiers well armed and equipped, they can defend you. So Elijah Johnson's his famous words were, we do not want, he said, any flag raised here that will cost us more trouble to pull down than to flog the natives. So in his mind, go ahead.
Hold on there, Carl.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier, you talk about the British dealing with Boswell, is that correct?
Yes.
And who was more like an agent for them.
Yes.
And then at the same time, they had sold some weapons to the natives. Is that correct?
For many different groups have been selling weapons because the indigenous were involved in slave trading, many wars. Everybody needed to be armed. So yes, the British were also selling weapons, supplying weapons. I wouldn't even say selling, supplying weapons.
What was Elijah Johnson's fear here at this point to have refused the British, offer of soldiers and also the flag that they wanted to plant on the soil? What was the fear here?
So the fear is what he said. It would be more trouble to remove the flag. Once that British flag is hoisted, it's not coming down. So they set up a stage to terrorize these people in the absence of, they were literally abandoned by ACS and the US government. And now the British are coming in and saying, well, you've been abandoned, we can help you. We'll start, we'll send these soldiers, get them off the ship. They'll come over there, they'll fight, and they'll defend you. But all we need you to do is let us raise our flag. And Elijah said no.
And raising that flag meant something other than just trying to offer help.
It meant taking over. And he knew that because, as I said earlier, he understood how the British conducted themselves because he fought in that War of 1812. And he knew that once that flag was up, it would be more trouble to pull it down. So basically, he's saying, over my dead body, I didn't suffer this long to come back to Africa to have the British come and subdue me.
And at that time, at this period, did he have enough manpower? It's obvious he didn't, and he was willing to die here, other than to accept an offer that was not sincere. That's what I sense in here.
Yes, and this was a critical decision because had he not done this, there would have been no way for ACS or anyone. America was nothing when it comes to world powers. This is in the 1830s. America was very weak compared to England. That British flag goes up. America wasn't going to be able to help them. Nobody was going to be able to help them.
And at that time, the Americans, is it that they didn't have any presence around to help Elijah here? As the British were around, was that the case at the time?
They had no presence, and they had abandoned. They had Ayers, as I said earlier, Eli Ayers. I'm sorry, Ashman had abandoned them. Everyone had abandoned them. They were left alone. And Elijah, being the strongest, he just assumed the responsibility of the head of the colony. It wasn't even a colony; it was just a settlement of a few people, few survivors.
Wow. I see why earlier you said he can be credited to a greater extent for what is now Liberia, because if he had agreed for the flag of the British to have been planted at the time, the British would have said, well, our flag is here, this is our land. This story would be different, isn't it?
It would be very different. We'd all be, speaking Freetown Creole.
Wow. Wow. Oh my God. But let me read that piece and then you can put some explanation on it. Then we can move to the next slide. The day warriors took advantage of Ashman's absence.
I kind of already read this. I just would interrupt myself and talk. Yeah. So we can go to the next one. Yeah.
All right. That's fine.
So Elijah was born when his father was a Methodist Episcopal pastor when he went to Liberia. He went to Liberia really as clergy, as a missionary, not as a soldier, but his military experience was helpful, as you can see in the previous slide. So this sketch, I love this sketch because this was actually done at the first settlement. This was actually what the first settlement looked like. And I think that, it's just incredible. So when they went, they would have church service and all of these things. And someone, I don't know who these people are supposed to be depicted, but I'm imagining when Elijah Johnson and other clergy were holding church service, it would be outside like this. And the other powerful thing about the depiction is it not only shows, it shows these people. Some are clearly recaptured Africans and some are African Americans. You can see the diversity just from the sketch in the population. At the time, people talk about segregation that is very far from the truth. When I look at some of these census records from the 1830s, 1843, people were pretty well integrated. They were going to the same churches, going to the same schools. They had what they called Christianized Africans. And the Christianized Africans, and then they had recaptured Africans. So they made a distinction between the Christianized, I'm sorry, not Africans, but the Christianized natives and the recaptured Africans. But they were all going to the same schools with the sons and daughters of African American repatriates. So really, there was a lot of integration and intermarriage from very early on. They worshiped together, they went to school together. And so what ends up happening, if you are a Christianized native child, And you started going to school, let's say in 1822, when Loch Carey opened up his school for indigenous children and for recaptured Africans. If you became, by 1832, you've been in school for 10 years and you've been worshiping Christ for 10 years. So if you were 8 years old in 1822 and you joined the colony and started going to school, by the time you're 18 in 1832, you're culturally similar. You're more culturally similar to the African American repatriates than you would have been to your original people. So many of those young girls, and there were many young girls in the schools, became the wives of the repatriated African Americans. Yes.
Interesting.
Yes, it is. And so this is the census from 1843, I believe. Yes, 1843. So you have Elijah. At this point, he is 54 years old.
Yeah.
So he came to the colony at 29. When they're doing the census, he's now 54. His wife, Rachel, is 45. It doesn't say Rachel Wright Johnson. It just says Rachel Johnson. Rachel is not a repatriated African American because there's no record of a Rachel Wright being on any ship going to Liberia between 1820 and 1843 when the census was done.
So it's safe that he met Rachel here in Liberia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Because his actual wife that he traveled with, as I showed on the previous slide, died at Sherbrooke,
Right.
who was on Elizabeth.
Yeah, in 1820.
Yes.
Okay.
So Elijah had a lot of children. I'm sorry, y'all.
He was a busy man.
Had a lot of children. He had children in America before, he went to Liberia. He went to Liberia. I mean, he took children with him to Liberia. He left children in the United States. And when he got to Liberia, he made more children. So he had Ellen, who was Ellen R. Johnson, who was, she was 15. So it's interesting that President Hilary Johnson's older sister's name was Ellen Johnson. But Ellen Johnson was 15, Rebecca Johnson, 12, Jane Johnson, 8 years old. Hilary, this is our president. The subject of this episode was 6 years old when the census was taken. Son of Elijah and Rachel Johnson, it says, and he could read. So 6 years old, his father made sure he was getting some literacy. Colonette Johnson, who was his younger sister, 3 years old, and then there was an infant, there was a baby.
Yeah. Wow.
So he had a lot of children. This guy was the Johnny Appleseed of African Americans. I mean, he has children now on 2 continents in abundance.
And did you not get an estimate of the total number of children he had, both in the U.S. and in Liberia?
I was able to come up with about 12, about 4 that he had in the United States, and then I think it was 3 that he traveled with, and then these children. Okay. And I don't know if he had any more children after that infant before he died. Okay. But the last thing I want to say, which I'm sure all of you know, Elijah Johnson represented Massarato County on the Constitution Committee. He was one of those that demanded for Liberia's independence. And so he is one of the founding fathers of the Republic.
I mean, see how he sits, elegantly dressed, and it's obvious that is a photograph. It doesn't look like a drawing, isn't it?
Right, it's a photograph. So this is now the subject of our the son of the founding father, Hilary Richard Wright Johnson. That's his actual signature. This photo and signature were first published in The Bright Side of Africa. That's the name of the book. Yeah, that's the president. So he was born in 1837, and his mother was either a recaptured African, which means she was a African woman liberated, or maybe as a child liberated from a slave ship, or she was a indigenous woman who was early assimilated as a child. That I have not been able to determine, but his mother was not an immigrant. She was African born. She was an African woman. So he was born in June of 1837, Elijah, and he died in 1901. He went to, in 1857, he graduated from Alexandra High School, what they called the Day's Hope in Monrovia, Liberia. In 1872, he received his Master of Arts at the Liberia College, which became the University of Liberia. In 1882, he obtained his Doctor of Law degree from Liberia College, later University of Liberia. So he was well educated, more educated than his father and his mother. When Elijah's father died, he was a child, so he grew up very poor. And even when when Hilary's father died, he was young and he grew up poor. Elijah Johnson didn't have a lot of money. He wasn't a rich man. He wasn't one of the rich merchants of Monrovia. So that's important to note. So Hilary, born in Liberia to an African mother and to an immigrant father, was he pretty much grew up without a lot of wealth and support, but he still managed to go to school, living with his mother. There's no evidence that his mother remarried. She was relatively old, when she was significantly older than most of the women who would have been remarried. And the amount of children she had, she must have struggled quite a bit. If you see on the previous slide, she had all those kids. So she must have struggled quite a bit. Okay. So in 1856, he was about 19 years old. This is a picture of President Stephen Allen Benson. Hilary was a special assistant to Stephen Allen Benson.
And did you say 18? At age 18?
About 19.
19.
About the age of 19. So he served as special assistant, special secretary, whatever you want to call it, to President Benson, the second president of the Republic of Liberia, photographed here, or his photograph shown here. He was also a principal of the Baptist school at the Day's Hope. And so he ended up being a principal of the school that he graduated from. And don't be confused, this is Stephen Allen Benson. I just wanted to show who, highlighted that he was special assistant to Stephen Allen Benson. This is not President Johnson, this is Stephen Allen Benson. He was also editor of the Liberian Herald, the Liberia Herald. So the Herald newspaper, when I always laugh or try to, tease our current newspapers, because I say, the Liberia Herald, almost 200 years ago was better written than with fewer mistakes than the, major newspapers of our time, of our era. These guys were excellent. So he served as an editor, which means he had to have been impeccably detail oriented and brilliant, because I read the Liberian Herald. I do a lot of the research I do for these presentations. I don't see typos. I don't see problems. It's like, wow, I wish, we could behave like they did back then and take our work that seriously. But they definitely, the Liberia Herald was more professionally done than newspapers of our era from Liberia, which is a shame.
And Carl, before you continue, let me take a few moments here to reflect on what you just said. So this is a newspaper we're talking about in 1859. The young man became an editor. You are saying from, the editions you read, you didn't see typo, you didn't see grammatical errors.
No.
I mean, that goes to say that we had a more solid educational system at the time. There might have been some that mean, it's obvious, right? A lot of things happened along the way and broke that standard, that substance, that quality. So if we have not had all of these, it's obvious we'll be in a much better place.
Right.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that. Continue.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, and these schools, I mean, you're talking about, this is before electricity. Right. So this is before computers. This is, these people were taught grammar, they were taught punctuation, they were taught how to read and write, how to think critically. I mean, in 1862, Hilary became a member of the House of Representatives for Macerado. 1864, he now, besides being a principal at the Baptist high school that he graduated from, he now becomes, the preparatory. He's now principal of the preparatory department of Liberia College, which again becomes like University of Liberia. So he was very much into academics and education. It was important. And a lot of these positions that he held in these time periods didn't really pay much. It's important to know that a lot of times when you served as heads of schools and things like that, this was not lucrative. This was work that you did because you wanted to do it. It was a service to your country and your people. So a lot of these schools didn't pay much compensation to their teachers and their leaders. So it was something they took seriously. It was, you have to give back to your community. You have to volunteer. And so I thought that was important to mention, that holding these positions was not, even in the House of Representatives, they weren't paid very much. Most of these men had farms, they were farmers, and you serving in these positions was really about driving policy and ideology than it was about making money. So it was, you were given a stipend. It was not considered a full-time job. Your full-time job, your career where you made money was your business. If you were a lawyer, if you were a farmer, if you were a merchant, that's where you focused your energy on making money. But the positions they held in government were a service to their country. So most of these, in fact, all of these representatives and senators in these days were highly educated, successful people, enlightened people who helped to drive the policy and the decisions of the state. Not to get huge paychecks and then go and be wasting rice on people.
Interesting. Young Hilary jumps in that, going through the ladder of our experience, if I want to pull it that way,
Yes.
Getting these jobs at a young age and will go to become president. Interesting.
Yes, and literally, I love that, the ladder of experiences. That's what it was. And he being the son of the most prominent citizen, really, one of the most prominent citizens, might not have been rich, but made a very profound contribution to the establishment of Liberia. He still had to work his way up.
Yep.
Now, when Daniel B. Warner, the best friend of Stephen Allen Benson, when Warner becomes president, Warner makes him, this is a photograph of Daniel Bashir Warner. When President Warner becomes president, he brings Hilary on now as Secretary of State. This is huge.
It is huge.
So now he is Secretary of State for the Republic of Liberia under President Warner. He served for 2 years as Secretary of State, and then he wanted to be an educator, because that's where really his heart and mind was. It was in education. He then goes on to serve as a professor for 11 years.
Yes.
Professor of philosophy. So here's a generation of people who are heavily involved in philosophy, critical thought, enlightenment. This was the age of enlightenment, not only for Liberia, but for African Americans as well. If you study Black history, you know that this time period was an era, it was almost like a Renaissance period. This was the golden age for Black thought. This was the age that gave birth to the concept, the ideology of Pan-Africanism. So this is a time period. This man is a professor. He serves as a professor of philosophy for 11 years. There's many, speeches and papers that Hilary Richard Wright Johnson wrote that exhibit his brilliance. So he was extremely, extremely smart. In 1870, he was Secretary of the Interior under President E.J. Roy.
Yeah,
1871, yeah. And then in 1871, he's Secretary of State for the Provisional Government. We all know that Provisional Government occurred after the coup against E.J. Roy, executed by or headed by Joseph Jenkins Roberts. So Roberts' second term begins right after this provisional government. And that provisional government was headed by Smith, James Girving Smith. We discussed that in previous episodes, who was the vice president to Roy.
And Carl, for better understanding, what would their provisional government be? Is this something we'll describe as interim government, or how can you best pull it?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's an interim government, because the president who was Smith served for that 3 months. He wasn't elected vice president under Roy. So it was somewhat of a coup, and it wasn't a complete overthrow of the government, because many were retained. And it was really unconstitutional, because you had Roberts appointing people, shuffling the government around, and there's really no constitutional provision for that. But that happened, and then ironically, Roberts becomes president as soon as the term ends.
And that was done through election, correct?
No, not really. We talked about that in another episode, but we're talking about President Johnson today. So, and in 1872 to 1873, he served again as Secretary of State and Secretary of the Interior under Joseph Jenkins Roberts. There's an actual photograph of Roberts. Blow that up a little bit for me. I want to show everybody Robert's hair. If you're talking about a man that quadroon, you see it here? There is no quadroon with hair that nappy.
And this time there was Robert's second term.
Yes. So this is Joseph Jenkins Roberts after the coup d'etat and the lynching of E.J. Roy. 1884 to 1892, he was a president. His vice president was James W. Thompson. And then in 1892, he served as Postmaster General.
Postmaster. And Postmaster today will be referred to as what?
It's the same thing. It's Minister of Post and Telecom, I guess, is what we call it. My late uncle, Dr. Frederick Nuckett, was the Minister of Post and Telecom. That's a comparison.
And was that a big deal then, this position of Postmaster at the time?
Yes. Because that was organizing communication outside the country, within the country. If you needed to send communication to Cape Palmas, if you needed to send communication to the United States, they made sure that it ran like clockwork and things were taken aboard ships. They organized, for merchant ships coming and going. The postal system for Liberia was very advanced and well organized. The communications between Liberia and other places around the world, Europe, well coordinated.
Interesting. So in 1884, Johnson was nominated by both the Republican Party and the True parties. Johnson ran unopposed in his first election. After his victory, he declared himself a True. He was the first Liberian president to have been born on the African continent.
Yes. So in 1884, you have two warring factions of the Liberian political community, both agreeing that Elijah Johnson's son, Hilary, Richard Wright Johnson, should be their president, and nobody ran against him. Again, because he was over qualified for this position, and everyone agreed that he had worked up the ranks of government to get to where he was. And they looked to the left, they looked to the right, they looked behind, they looked in the mirror, and they said, no, there is no equal to this man. He should be the president. And they all agreed. That has never happened since. This is the only time in the history of Liberia that this has happened, that all the political parties nominate the same person.
And they could not resist the impressive resume and experiences he had obtained over the years. At 19, was an assistant to a president, and then he will serve as Secretary of State for the 3 times from what we read. Secretary of the Interior, I think about 2 times, served as a professor for 11 years. I mean, that's a whole lot of goal to become postmaster. Yeah,
Yes.
he was overqualified. You couldn't have said it right. He was.
So
Okay.
now he became Postmaster General after his presidency, by the way.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the things that occurred that's important to point out is the annexation of the territory of Galinas by the British. And we talk about the reason I talked about the War of 1812 and went on to talk about his father standing up to the British when the British were attempting to take, the little bit of territory in 1822 that Liberia had, which was smaller than the current city of Monrovia, just about a community, really. Now you have his son is president, and the British are taking over Galinas. Galinas is the area where the notorious slave dealer Pedro Blanco had his major slave depot. So many of the smaller slave depots along the coast, like at Trade Town, at Vi Town in Monserrato, along the Cavala, all these places would feed into Galinas. So slaves came to Galinas territory in two ways. They came from the north, which is the Guinea Forest, Peru, that whole area. What is now Lofa, maybe even as far as, who knows. And then they would also come from the coast. So you would have vessels picking up slaves at the various depots, and then they would go to Galinas, and then the transatlantic vessels would then transship them to whether it be Puerto Rico or Cuba or the United States. Galinas was that major transshipment location. J.J. Roberts destroyed Galinas with the British, with the help of the British Navy. They went in and they blew stuff up. Okay, completely destroyed the slave depots during his first presidency. At that time, Hilary Richard Wright Johnson was a child. They destroyed it, and Liberia put their flag at Galinas. This is before colonialism. This is Joseph Jenkins Roberts' first presidency. So Galinas, the first country that Galinas was incorporated in was Liberia. It is under Hilary that Galinas becomes Sierra Leone. Or not Sierra Leone, but becomes British territory, and then later on becomes Sierra Leone during colonialism. So that's really sad to me. He was up against so much violence and the threat of violence from the British. You had the Vi Kingdom being split in half. King Massaquoi trying to get aid from the Liberians. In their weak way, they attempted to assist. The Americans, through diplomatic pressure from England, advised him to cede or yield to the British. It was a horrible, horrible loss. We lost a lot of citizens to the British who did not want to be British. So King Massaquoi's mother's entire kingdom on the other side of the Galinas River, all those Mende and Vi people are now Sierra Leoneans. And everything on our side, it becomes Cape Mount. It remains Cape Mount, it remains part of Liberia. That did not happen without a serious fight. But at some point they realized that, they had to see, they didn't have support. They're fighting the most powerful military in the world. And unfortunately, we lost that whole territory to the British.
Wow, profound piece of history. Carl, let me do something you may not like. I'm still reflecting on this previous slide, right? And I think the reason you put your time in this history teaching, is for us to reflect and so
Yes.
that we can make better decisions. So these are two political parties you call the Liberian political warring factions at the time.
It's an
Yeah,
exaggeration, but yeah.
yeah, agreeing that and Hilary should be the president, and no one opposed him, and he became president. Now, and we look at his qualification from the age of 19, he worked way up, all these positions, and so no one could question his qualification. So
Yes.
for them to have come to that unanimous agreement that yes, he is best suited to serve as our president, I'm curious here. Was it because they have put premium on qualification and experience at the time, and when you flip that to today, how we are making decisions, it's a more that we're not putting premium on qualification and experience, and maybe we are putting premium on political parties because there were political parties, and yet they made a decision. I'm just curious to get your take because this is something to reflect on deeply.
This was a time period
Mhm,
when Liberians still believed themselves to be self-determinate human beings.
mhm,
This was a time period when Liberians still believed that they could self-govern and that they could achieve greatness.
mhm,
This is a time the Liberians still believed that they were the light of the continent of Africa in the sense that they could overcome the stigma and the oppression attached to a few centuries of degradation and slavery that had been imposed upon the African continent and its
mhm,
citizens and its people. They believed that they could be a beacon of hope for the rest of the continent to lift itself out of the yoke of subjugation that was not even formalized yet, but was evident. Um, so they didn't have the option to promote mediocrity. They needed the best among them to lead them through this period of time when the entire world was against them. They knew they
mhm.
couldn't do this by some, patronage or popularity contest. They needed the strongest and the brightest among them to do things. And this is why the country still exists today, is because of decisions that were made. And we made some we in modern times we've made some really foolish mistakes, mostly because we don't have any idea how we became a country. We don't have any idea about the giants whose shoulders we're standing on. The self-esteem of the nation at that time was great. These people believed in their human beingness. And today we no longer believe in our human beingness. We think we've got the lowest self-esteem. I think we're at the lowest point in our history. We have become groveling beggars. It's a sad thing.
It
That
is.
when you read some of the speeches and the thoughts and the letters coming out of these leaders at this period of time, when you read the vision of Wolo or Twet, Marias, you read these people's thoughts over the years, and then you look at the people who are available today and calling themselves leaders. It is the greatest example of degeneration I've ever seen. How did we
Mhm,
come from these people? How can Netisie Brunel, who lived at that time when human beings in America could not drink from the same drinking fountain, could not sit next to white people? Netisie Brunel had such dignity and self-respect and foresight and intelligence. And when you read words that he wrote and you compare that to modern people that are alive today, it is really depressing to see how low we have sunk as a country. in comparison to these people, both indigenous and repatriated.
Carl, I don't regret getting you started. We needed that deep.
Let's get back on subject.
We needed to reflect on that
Yeah,
because as I think about it profoundly, and my thirst, your thirst to see a Liberia that knows itself, right? and
yes,
and and that we're not there yet. We everybody looking to some kind of hero who doesn't have a spine. It just
yeah.
kills my spirit. But let leave it that. Let me progress. And folks, if you are watching Focus on Liberia, this is the Liberian Liberia History Channel. We call Formula as our presenter. We'll take a short break here. When we come right back, we'll continue with the presentation. Please do not go anywhere. This is in continuation of our series presidents of Liberia. We all recited the names of the president only. But here's the good side. This is your only chance to get to know your presidents, to get to know the decisions they made, who they were, and maybe it will help all of us as we go forward to make decisions. We are hearing about Hilary R.W. Johnson standing tall as a Liberian leader. Can we stand on his shoulders today? I think we'll do. When we understand him, we will be in a much better place. We'll be right back momentarily.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jar.
And I am Anthony C.A., sitting in for Dennis Jar, hosting today, and our presenter is Carl Famler. We are back with you. Please stick with us. Let us learn history. Carl, we are back, and this is our next slide.
Yes. So you can go ahead and read.
Okay. After his term, he dedicated his time to farming and became a successful coffee producer. The former president continued serving his country as he had done since his youth. He was the postmaster general in the Coleman administration, and when he fell ill, his son, F.E.R. Johnson, assumed his father's responsibilities. The former president died in February 1901 at the age of 63.
And he's buried at the Oak Grove Cemetery in Liberia. And his grave, when I toured the cemetery, the graves of a lot of really prominent people, not only in Liberian history, but African world history, their graves are they've been looted. Some of them are empty. Some of them are hangout spots or sleeping quarters for drug addicts. There's no bodies in them. Some of them, completely looted. Whatever, the history they were buried with has been taken, maybe hawked on the streets. Their jewelry, their personal belongings, whatever they were laid to rest in. I mean, it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever had to witness as a person who loves history, is walking through that cemetery and seeing how we have destroyed these people that are responsible in so many ways for African liberation in general, and this concept of Pan-Africanism that we all take for granted. But yeah, so his son actually, I want to clarify that the responsibilities his son took over were not as postmaster general, but of the farm. The farm, his son became the coffee producer and ran his father's personal business. And so I just wanted to point that out. But you can go to the next slide.
Okay.
So
let's do that quickly.
Frederick Eugene Richelieu Johnson, who is the son of Hilary Richard Wright Johnson, became an attorney and Chief Justice for Liberia. So he became an attorney just like his father, and he served from 1929 to 1933. So that pretty much ends the slideshow. I wanted to just give a brief overview of President Hilary Wright Johnson, and I would like to, invite everyone to call in or when Sonny can read the questions that the audience may have, and I would like to just hear your thoughts and answer questions if you have any.
Yep, let's read the comments here quickly. They are not that many, so I'll run through them quickly here. No, this is not for us here. Thank COR and FOL for teaching us real history of Liberia. This one says, imagine a topic like this is not spoken about on the so-called big platforms. Thanks for the topic, guys. God bless you. Then this one is from River Says Pro. Wow. I was told that Edwin J. Barclay was the first of the Liberian president to be born in Liberia. Indeed, you have a revelation and you're not dreaming, you're just getting the truth. This from Annie. Annie says, so true. This is from Mr. Gibman. Beautiful show and subject. Annie, again, very good question, sir. I don't know which one, the one I asked maybe. Thanks very much for this knowledge. This is a class of its own, I believe the person said. This is our YouTube watcher. Liberia has such a great history. We should be proud of what we built and seek to reestablish these institutions today. Annie writes, I am related to the Warners. Oh, Annie, it's good to know that you are related to the Warners. You should get in touch with us. Maybe there are some stories you can add to enrich this discussion. Go ahead.
And Annie, we found your ancestors' actual photograph. So the fake drawing that they've been showing everyone as Mr. Warner, calling him a mulatto, false fake news. We have debunked it and rescued his photo from the unknown archives. And so let us know if you wanted. I think FOL posted it too.
Yeah, we posted it.
President Warner's photograph.
This one's from River Says Pro. Was E.J. Raw lynched, or did he drown in the Atlantic Ocean while trying to escape criminal persecution? Keep that. Let me read the rest, and then you can come to that call. I heard that E.J. Raw drowned. Is it true? Call will have something to share with you. Annie, again, very, very educational. Makes you know that's actually more about your country and the history of our land. River Says Pro, isn't from a Secretary of State to a school teacher a downgrade, and that's what you worry about? Service is service, my friend. River Says Pro again, greetings from River Says County. You see, the Liberians are watching from everywhere. Let me read this one. They have some good infrastructure set up in terms of institutions in their community. We need institutions to build on. And the history, I would say, is the institution, because it's the idea, it's the knowledge, and it's here. It's not more about the physical, what she's telling you about, people standing on the spirit, and and the structures of the structure here, not meaning the physical. And those things they put in place for the running of the country. So we have them, but maybe we're not looking at them. I am definitely subscribing. I love this content. Yep, subscribe to Focus on Liberia YouTube channel, and your life will be one that gets the information. Let's get from Joseph here. The planting of the flare may have been looked upon by Elijah Johnson as a sort of a Greek bearing gift.
That's a good analogy.
Annie is basically a good evening, afternoon. I'm watching. Let's hear from Mindset of a Champion, which image is shown to Liberians today. And we reveal the real image yet here, focus on Liberia. Former President Samuel K. Doe was the worst president of Liberia. He changed presidential term from 4 years to 6 years. You think that Doe did that by himself? Maybe
I
you
know,
know
right?
it. Wow. Remember in grammar school, we recited all the president's name up to Thomas. You think was it grammar school or just history? I think it would be history. Our CEO posted here, welcome to the Liberian History Channel. We are focusing on President Hilary W. Johnson and Emmanuel here watching from Boston. Cole, we have two good questions there. Do you remember them?
The E.J. Roy question, we have 4
Mhm,
episodes dedicated to E.J. Roy. The
mhm,
story about E.J. Roy drowning by himself.
mhm,
Um, I don't believe that is what happened. There are other accounts that support my statement about him being murdered.
mhm,
But again, watch the show. I do present the episodes. I do present both versions.
mhm.
And you use your own deductive reasoning to determine what you think is true. I was not present. I can only use my own logic, listening to both or reading both versions, I should say, and determining which is more likely the truth. He was really, I believe that he was murdered. The same, and a lot of great people were murdered that, around that issue. Even our great explorer, Benjamin Joseph Knight Anderson, was shot to death. Was basically executed. They almost killed um, Edward Wilmot Blyden similarly. Blyden was more fortunate than Benjamin Joseph Knight Anderson, in that Blyden was able to escape to Sierra Leone. But they systematically picked off a lot of great African thinkers in Liberia, systematically killed them. So that's another show we'll do after we finish the presidents.
Yeah. Let me read the remaining comments here. What contribution did he make to education? Jerome, are you just coming? Is the deprivation of education to the native that got us here? Jerome, I think you
So
coming
I'm
late.
going to actually respond to that.
Mhm,
This idea of deprivation of education to indigenous
mhm,
people, that is just unfounded. I'm educated. My mother's educated. Our ancestors, some of whom we think are Congo or Americo-Liberian today, were educated. The very first school that was built by the repatriated African Americans, I should say, was by Lot Carey, and he started his school immediately upon arriving at Cape Mesurado. Started teaching the recaptured Africans that he was assigned to. He got a little area of land at Bushrod Island and opened a school where he started right off the bat teaching recaptured Africans and indigenous Liberian children. If you look at all of the census records from the Commonwealth of Liberia, all of the schools they called them Christianized natives. They had native children in the schools. You cannot expect a population of 1,500 people who are Black in a time when people are still in shackles and chains and enslaved to be able to educate about 1 million human beings who have their own culture, have their own way of life, their own belief systems, and their own form of education. How would that have looked? Would they have had to go there with weapons to drag as my ancestors from Nimba and force them into school? It was impossible. That's not deprivation at all. This concept, this low self-esteem that modern Liberians have, that their ancestors were empty, naked savages that needed to be trained or educated by people who were settling, is absurd. They had a country, they had their own belief systems, and education was something voluntary. Most of the indigenous children, the indigenous Liberian children who were educated, were rescued from slave factories in the early days. They were taken to the mission schools, at the mission schools because they ran away from some form of domestic servitude in their indigenous villages. Those things cause those kind of conflicts. A lot of the Madingo children, or the children that were serving Madingo households along the St. Paul River, escaped and went to the settlements for education. And their descendants all are considered Congo today. So, I mean, you've got the father of Vice President Dosen, J.J. Dosen's father was one of those people who were educated early on. J.J. Dosen himself an indigenous person. You said the indigenous people were deprived of education. Some of the most educated Liberians, before 1900 were indigenous people. So just because we don't know something doesn't give us a right to falsify a narrative. I'm a Mono woman. My ancestors did not speak English. My ancestors were not given a Roman script until the Republic of Liberia was established. We had literacy in Liberia before the Republic of Liberia was established. There were some who spoke, read, and wrote English, like King Peter Bromley. There were also, before the Liberian Republic was established, many, many people who read and wrote Arabic. So this concept that, the Native people were deprived, we were not children to be given something. We were human beings. You deprive your child, you deprive your pets, your dogs. Talk better about our ancestors. Respect the legacy of the people that brought us forth. This concept that indigenous people were sitting around, without a country, waiting for someone to come and fill their empty vessels, their empty heads with something is disrespectful to our ancestors. And it is also not the truth. It was voluntary. And as it is still to this day, you cannot force someone to go to school. It is something that people choose to do. I can't hear you.
Four of the grandfathers of Pan-Africanism all...
So God, I was muted.
Okay.
I ran into this video.
Yeah.
And I'm going to play it and get your take, because earlier in the presentation, you talk about Pan-Africanism, how Liberia was looked up to, especially our leaders in the past. So let's get this.
All went through Liberia. Henry Highland Garnett. Four of the grandfathers of Pan-Africanism all went through Liberia. Henry Highland Garnett, who escaped from slavery in Maryland through FDMG Delaware, becoming one of the most revolutionary Pan-Africanists in American history. He's buried in Monrovia. John Brown Russworm from Jamaica. Garvey before Garvey, who published the first black newspaper out of New York, Freedom's Journal, with FDMG Delawarean Samuel Cornish in 1827. He's buried in Monrovia. Edward Wilmot Blyden from the Bahamas, St. Thomas, came through America, went to Liberia, became Secretary of State. Alexander Crummell, who went to the Free African School in New York with Henry Highland Garnett, became the father of black social work, the first black man to build an intellectual society for black men, gave 20 years of his life to Liberia public schools. Lost a daughter over there before coming back to help organize black men to fight for their freedom in the Civil War. So there is no Pan-Africanism without Liberia. There is no Pan-Africanism without Liberia. We have to look at making Liberia once again the heart and soul of Pan-Africanism, like it was. As it was before, so shall it be in the end. As it was before, so shall it be in the end. I want Africans to understand those words. When I say, as it was before, so shall it be in the end, I'm telling you that we are going to return to our greatness as a people. We have a divine destiny to reclaim our glory. But I want to be clear, brothers and sisters. I want to be clear.
And Carl, I will stop it there, and I want you to restrict it, your response, the reaction, or your take to this video to Liberia. Looking at our presidents, looking at our leaders, both indigenous leaders, just to put it that way, leaders who were free slaves and went and settled, and some became presidents, some secretary of state. I mean, he's saying we have to go back to where we were. Talk to me about that. Your take.
I mean, this is what he's saying to me is obvious. I mean, I'd rather hear other people's takes. I mean, that's what we talk about all the time. I mean, he left many names off of that. You know, he left Elijah Johnson out. He left, you know, Hilary Teague out. Really, Pan-Africanism began with Elizabeth, right? You have these, he left out a lot, but it's okay. What he said was profound and it's true. And we do have a responsibility to ourselves and to Africa to raise our consciousness and our understanding and stop being the torchbearers for the false and fake narrative that has destroyed our country. The brainwashing is so extreme that people do not even have, like, they don't even rationalize information the way that they should. You know, you're talking, the other thing that people do is they have a personal bad experience and then they project that upon history because they have no idea what happened before they were born to cause the world to be organized the way it is. They also don't understand the incredible sabotage, divide and conquer tactics that were used against Liberia. I spent every single episode laying some of this out. It's important to understand that Liberia as an idea is an affront to white supremacy. Liberia as an idea was an affront to colonialism. Liberia as an idea is an affront to Western economic exploitation of Africa. And the only way to continue the exploitation is to get in the heads of the Liberian people to make them think that they're nothing. And to complain about petty things, petty things in the great scheme of things. They hyper focus on the most petty, insignificant stuff. Bunch of crybabies. Every country in this world has had disparity in wealth and education. Africa, there's nowhere in Africa that has had the level of integration and equality that Liberia has had. Nowhere on the continent. We sit here and take for granted all of the good things that we have inherited as a country and hyper focus on petty things that other countries experience tenfold. Yet you've got people in places like Sierra Leone where they were chained and enslaved and forced to build railroads and roads in cities like Abidjan in chains and bondage. This never happened in Liberia. But when Ivorians talk about their history, they talk about the French, about themselves with respect and reverence. Ghana. I mean, look at all these countries. There is nothing that Liberia has experienced that is even remotely as horrific as what our neighbors experience. Yet we sit here. Why? Because we were established by people who look like us. So this internalized hatred, now we project it for generations and ignore their greatness and our own greatness. We want to reduce our own ancestors to petty little savages that were conquered by a handful of people coming off a ship. It's absurd. That's not what happens. That's not who we are. Was there discrimination? Is there westernization when you become educated, when you become Christian? Do you start to look down on your ancestry? Yes, you do. You're doing it today. Then why judge people in the 1800s for doing what you're doing today? Why judge people in the 1800s for taking on Western names when you're naming your children Western names today? Judging people in the 1800s for refusing to live like villagers when you're refusing to live like villagers today. It's absurd.
You couldn't have said it so profoundly, and we need to reflect much more deeper. We are standing on the shoulder of giants, as you always quoted here.
Yes.
And I listened to that gentleman speaking. There is no Pan-Africanism without Liberia.
Without Liberia.
Without Liberia. This is a citizens of the United States speaking, well-educated men who research and telling us about what we have to build on. And we will take some isolated incident and balloon it because it impacted us maybe personally. We are not dismissing what happened to others. Those were choices made by other people who were not thinking right. But if we look at the bigger picture of what our country is, given the history lesson we are learning today, we have to do better and think better. We had great leaders like President Hilary W. Johnson. His education, this man taught for 11 years teaching philosophy at what is now University of Liberia. What else could he have done? This is the son of a former soldier who father literally left him with nothing, educated himself, walked through the ranks. And we Liberians are looking for examples of how to find leaders. We want to cry about petty stuff. I don't want to get started here because the whole truth and the whole truth of our history must be told. And Carl, I'll give you the last opportunity here. I'm more than convinced now that if we all have had the opportunity to read our history, know it, maybe we'll be in a much better place.
Absolutely.
We'll not have our young people, all right, running behind spineless people, who themselves don't understand the history and the country they want to represent, who would not be in this place.
Yeah.
So I want to say thanks, and I will get your closing on today's edition. I think there was educational. I can say that any day.
Yeah, I think that one of the tactics of warfare is to, if you want to conquer people, is to cut them off from their history, miseducate them, misguide them, whitewashing our presidents, distorting our history, coming up with an exaggerated false narrative, ballooning differences between us, exacerbating them in order to create an even bigger wedge. These things were intentional. I say this almost every episode. We have to stop being the torchbearers for the false narratives that destroyed our country. We need to stop being the torchbearers for the false narrative and the hatred that destroyed the country that established African unity, the concept of African unity. It's ironic that people like Mr. Gaiman would say that indigenous people were denied education with zero evidence of this. You had an effort, a continuous effort to build schools throughout Liberia and push this concept of education onto people who did not necessarily welcome it. Education is voluntary. Education is something that people have to believe in and understand that it's for their future. I want you all to know two things that come out of the show. One, many of the people who made Liberia possible, many of the people that made it possible for Liberia to exist in those very early days were indigenous people. Many of the people who fought for Liberia's sovereignty against the British, against the French, were indigenous people. When we were talking about the battle at Galenas, it was mostly Vai, Gola, soldiers fighting on behalf of Liberia, lost their lives protecting the sovereignty of the Republic of Liberia. The same thing on our eastern borders, the same thing at our northern borders. The sovereignty of the country that we call Liberia was won with the blood, the sweat, the tears of indigenous people who wanted to protect the sovereignty of Liberia. If not for indigenous people buying into the idea of Liberia, it would not exist at all. So this simplistic narrative that is impossible, that could not have possibly happened, of only the descendants of repatriated African Americans, only they created Liberia, only they were educated, only they made decisions, is not true. And it would have been impossible for them to do it by themselves. That's something that I want everyone to take away from this, because that is a fact. This country is a collaborative effort. Nimba and Lofa do not stick that far into Guinea because American Liberians went there and fought. Nimba and Lofa, those iron-rich counties, those resource-rich counties, are part of Liberia today because the inhabitants, the ancient inhabitants of those places, defended their territory and protected Liberia against further French encroachment. I am not Guinean today because my ancestors chose to be Liberian and fought to be Liberian. Nimba is in Liberia today because my ancestors chose to be Liberian. So I wanted to point this out. The responsibility of education does not only fall on repatriated African Americans, it also falls on the leadership of indigenous people who had complete command and control of their land and their citizens, and how they wanted their land and their subjects to advance. If you know anything about Liberian history at all, you understand the resistance to the cultural invasion of westernized Africans. So that's not what you call deprivation, that's resistance. That's not deprivation, that's resistance. As recently as last month, people in Liberia resisting and wanting to hold on to cultural practices that don't belong in the modern world. As recently as last month. And the government still struggling to negotiate and convince them to do otherwise. To this day, people want to do FGM. Has no place in the modern world. We don't want to let it go because it's our tradition. Many, many things have occurred this way throughout history. So that's pretty much, I mean, that's my summary of it.
With that, we will come to the end of yet another edition of the Liberia History Channel here at Focus on Liberia. Always our presenter, Gov Famula, thank you for another episode.
I wanted to respond to something before you go. George
Please.
wrote something. He said education is a national duty and should be initiated by the government, not voluntary. Education was absolutely initiated by the government. Every mission school that came to Liberia was at the request of the government, with subsidies from the government, with support from the government, in fact, begging people to come in, which ended up being a huge mistake. We'll talk about in another episode. When I said voluntary, what I'm saying is the Liberian government to this day does not have the power to force people to go to school. To this day, they do not have the power to force people to go to school to this day. And most people in Liberian, Liberian citizens today believe that education is important. The majority at that time did not think that being educated in the Western sense was important. So those who went to school voluntarily. That does not mean that the government didn't initiate it. It's two different things. Government pushing for education and the citizens saying, no, we don't want to do that. We want to be Muslim. We're going to do Quranic education. Or no, we're going to Poro and Sende. Or no, we don't want to be like you. The indigenous people had a right to not want to be Westernized. They had been who they were, and they respected themselves for thousands of years. And you're going to come now and tell them that, oh, you got to come and read and write like us and dress like us? That was met with great resistance. That's so you can't say that, you know, it's not voluntary. What were they going to do? Beat everyone and tie them in front of a book? You cannot force anyone to learn. It's a choice.
It's a choice, and it's a choice for all of us now to learn our history.
Exactly.
So we can know ourselves better. And that would be a good choice if you do so. On that note, join us Saturday after next, I believe, for another edition of the Liberian History Channel here at Focus on Liberia. And as always, our song that says we are all Liberians is taking us home. God, thank you, and thanks to everybody for watching.
Thanks, everyone.
And those who will watch later. And bye-bye for now.
Bye. We are